Hey folks, this is Kelani. It looks like Titanforging might actually be gone for the last patch of Battle for Azeroth. Patch 8.3 will replace the Titanforging system that has been so controversial for this entire expansion, and even before that. Pretty much ever since it was introduced, it's been a bit of a question mark on the entire gearing up process, but we won't have to deal with it when this patch rolls around. But they couldn't just remove Titanforging, they had to come up with something to go in its place, for whatever reason. So what's going to be replacing Titanforging, how does it work, and is it actually going to be fun this time around? Let's have a look. The new system is called Corruption, or Corrupted Gear. Instead of your gear having a chance to Titanforge 20 or more item levels to throw it way past the power level of the current content you're actually clearing, they will have a chance instead to become corrupted. It looks like this will work for any piece of gear that isn't Azerite gear or your cloak, and I've managed to collect a corrupted item for pretty much every slot, including weapons. Alright, cool, these items can be corrupted, but what does that actually mean? As you're about to find out, it can actually mean quite a few things. There's several points to this whole corrupted item thing. If you're worried that this will be far more complicated than Titanforging, well, you're right. Corrupted items will have a special effect or bonus very similar to how benthic gear worked. That's the benefit of an item becoming corrupted. The items will also have a new corruption stat. Corruption can stack up to absurd levels, and as you hold more corruption in your gear, you'll start to see some weird effects and debuffs. You're going to have to balance the positive effects you want with a manageable amount of corruption, because the weird stuff that can happen when you have too much corruption can kill you very quickly. Let's have a look at the possible beneficial effects first, because there are quite a few. It looks like any item from the patch can become corrupted with any of these effects, so it's not like some bonuses are specific to just bracers and other bonuses are specific to just boots. You have a chance to get any of them on any piece of gear, which is definitely going to be a bit of a pain and just increase the amount of RNG in the system already, but hey, you can stack all of your best ones across all of your gear if you really get that lucky. The dev team has also decided to include both utility and throughput increases in these effects, which was a pretty big issue with some of the legendaries from Legion. Let's see how it pans out with this new system. Let's have a look at the possible effects. Here's the first one. Your avoidance is increased by an amount equal to 3%, 6% or 9% of your haste. Perhaps good for some tanks out there, and you can see that these effects aren't static like the benthic gear bonuses were. There's different values of each beneficial effect, which is going to add to the RNG system yet again. Here's another one. Increase the amount of haste you gain from all sources by 2%, 3% or 4%. That also goes for the other secondary stats, so we have one that increases all mastery by 2%, 3% or 4%, another one for critical strike by 2%, 3% or 4%, and of course versatility by 2%, 3% or 4%. Those are definitely going to be some effects to go after, especially if your class or spec scales particularly well with one secondary stat. Comparing this to an avoidance increase seems kind of silly. The vast majority of players will always take a throughput increase over a defensive increase unless the defensive increase is particularly powerful, which avoidance isn't really. And when you have 2%, 3% or 4% of your mastery stat, if mastery is your best stat, you're just going to want that one effect across all of your gear. It's going to be a hard sell to take any other effect from the corrupted items, surely. We also have 20%, 30% or 40% of total health regeneration now continues during combat. An interesting power for sure, but still probably not all too impactful when all is said and done. The next one increases your healing received from all sources by 2%, 4% or 6%. Again, a little different, maybe good for a tank to make sure they get every ounce of healing from your healers, but I still think it's lackluster for a utility power when compared to something like 4% additional haste or mastery from all sources. There's also one to increase your leech by 2%, 4% or 6%. Leech is definitely more powerful than healing received and will probably be a good pickup for various healers and has more potential for quirky little offsets. This next one will probably look very familiar, increases the damage you deal with critical strikes by 5%, 6% or 7%. I guess they wanted to bring this one over from the benthic gear because it has the potential to be very powerful for certain classes, and it is an interesting way to increase your throughput in my opinion, mainly because it's going to affect different classes or specs in different ways. Remember that these effects are available on almost all slots of gear. You could stack this single effect up for some devastating results, if you can manage the corruption anyway. Another defensive one next reduces your damage taken from periodic effects by 2%, 4% or 6%, may be useful if there's a particular fight that has a lot of damage over time, or maybe if you just hate warlocks and want to laugh at them while they try to deal damage to you in PvP. And then the last one we have to look at for right now doesn't actually have any tiers, which is a bit of a surprise. Your spells and abilities have a chance to grant you a flash of clarity, reducing the cooldown of your next 3 spellcasts by 2 seconds. This isn't a new effect either, it's copied from the Mechagon Bracers. The only difference is that you don't get to activate it, which might actually reduce its value quite significantly. Now you may be wondering, why would any of these bonuses ever be a bad thing? If you get Leech instead of crit, it doesn't really matter, right? Just hope for the crit one next time. Any bonus has to be better than no bonus. That might have been the case, except every single corrupted item has some value of corruption on it. You may have noticed that the better scaled effects also have higher corruption numbers. All of the effects have 3 different tiers except that very last one. Tier 1 being, 2%, and then Tier 2 being 4%, Tier 3 being 6%, or whatever the value actually is for the specific effect. The better the beneficial effect you get, the more corruption you're going to have to deal with. But the corruption number isn't static either, it's a range. Right now it looks like a tier 1 effect will come with 5 to 10 corruption, a tier 2 effect will have 12 to 17 corruption, and a tier 3 effect will come with 20 to 25 corruption. Now all of those numbers don't really mean anything unless you know what corruption actually does. As you start getting more and more corruption, you'll get various debuffs. As soon as you equip a single piece of corrupted gear or gain any corruption, you'll get the Grasping Tendrils debuff. Taking damage has a chance to slow your movement speed for 5 seconds. The magnitude of the slow increases with further corruption. Right now in this clip I have 6 corruption, that's almost as low as you can go. At this bare minimum level of corruption the slow is only by 16%, but as you add more corrupted gear it starts to get quite problematic. At 54 corruption, the slow is already at 64%, which is almost guaranteed to get you killed during any busy raid encounter. So right off the bat, you might start having troubles with this first corrupted debuff, but it only gets worse. When you get to 20 corruption, you'll also have to deal with the Corrupted Zone debuff. Your spells and abilities have a chance to create a corrupted zone at your location, dealing shadow damage to you every 2 seconds. The size and damage of the corrupted zone increase with higher corruption. This triggers from your spells and abilities too, so there's no avoiding this one. With the slow debuff, as long as you don't take damage too often, you shouldn't need to worry about it all too much, but this corrupted zone will be proccing constantly throughout every fight, as long as you're attacking. Which, I assume you am and you're not just AFK hoping for some loot from looking for raid, you cheeky devils. Thankfully the proc rate doesn't seem too bad and the zone does start quite small. This is at 22 corruption, so just over the threshold to actually start getting this debuff. You should be able to just sidestep this zone and maybe still be able to hit the boss, but as soon as you go higher, things get a little crazy. This is at 54 corruption. Yeah, if that plops down on a boss, you're waiting until it disappears before you can hop back into the fight. There's no way you're going to be able to fight through this without enraging all of your healers. At this point the cloud is doing 30 to 40k damage every 2 seconds. It's pretty nasty, it's hard to stand in. If you're on a boss where you absolutely have to stack, you just won't be able to have more than 20 corruption, I would think. There's another debuff when you hit 40 corruption too, Grand Illusions. Taking damage has a chance to summon a thing from beyond which pursues you for 10 seconds. Its speed is increased with further corruption. This thing is fast, and it deals a lot of damage if it manages to get to you. It probably won't be too bad if you're out in the world, but in dungeons or raids where you can't run around like a headless chicken for 10 seconds freely, it's probably going to be a huge problem. Can you imagine just seeing your hunter run sideways for whatever reason, straight into another pack, and the reason why he does it is because he was running away from a ghost. That's after he wipes you and explains everything, obviously. So even activating this debuff might be a bit too adventurous for raids and dungeons. It could be hilarious if this procs in PvP and gets you killed though. And the last debuff right now kicks in at 60 corruption, and you'll see why I say 60 corruption is probably going to be a hard limit. Creeping Death increases the damage you take from all sources and reduces the healing you take. This stacks higher and higher as you get more corruption. At 60 corruption, it's already 10% increased damage and reduced healing. If you start equipping pieces past that, the number will increase 1% per point of corruption. So at 150 corruption, you'll be at 100% increased damage and 100% reduced healing. I don't expect anyone to even consider running around with that much corruption, but you can see how things can get out of control pretty quickly. Having to deal with a slow, a massive AoE zone, and a ghost thing that randomly appears and tries to kill you is going to be awkward. The damage zone can proc off any abilities that you use. If you get damaged by it, you can start proccing your other things. You can get slowed in the damage zone, you can get slowed while the mob is chasing you. They work together to make things even more annoying, so managing your corruption is definitely going to be key in patch 8.3. Thankfully, there are going to be a few ways to control the corruption seeping from these items. The first is a pretty simple one. Some of the new essences in patch 8.3 have a unique equip attached to them that reduces your corruption by 10. That could be placeholder, but at the moment that fully negates one tier 1 corrupted item. Not too bad, but that does mean new essences are going to be potentially more powerful than they might initially seem. And then there's also something called corruption resistance. We don't know how this works just yet, and we haven't seen any items with it from what I can tell. From the name alone, we can assume that we'll be able to collect this resistance to offset more and more corruption as the patch unfolds, allowing us to eventually equip quite a few corrupted items without having to deal with all of the negative effects. From a recent blue post, we know that the new legendary cloak in patch 8.3 will definitely play a part in this system, providing us with more and more protection from the effects of corruption as we upgrade it. So not only will the legendary cloak be vital for the new vision system and for some of the fights in the new raid, but it's also going to play a role in allowing you to take advantage of this new version of Titanforging. The better your cloak is and the more upgrades you get for it, the more corrupted items you can make use of. So I hope you like time gates, because that's all the legendary cloak is at this point. But what if you get an item level upgrade that not only has a lackluster corrupted effect, but it also just has way too much corruption for you to make any use of? That would kind of suck, right? You just wouldn't be able to equip the item at all without having to deal with the negative effects of having too much corruption. Well, that same blue post also mentioned the ability to cleanse any corrupted item without restriction at the Heart Forge. So if an item does drop and you really want to use it, but the whole corrupted thing isn't something you want to deal with, or it's in the way, you can happily run over to the Chamber of Heart and clean all that N'Zoth goo off of it. It's stickier than I thought it would be. The cleansing feature having no restriction is definitely good news, though I wonder if it could have been tied back into the system by giving you a new form of currency that would allow you to purposefully corrupt an item of your choosing. Right now we don't have any choice or agency regarding an item becoming corrupted. It's just replacing Titanforging, so it either happens or it doesn't. Except unlike Titanforging, where any Titanforge was always a straight upgrade of the base item, a corrupted item has a lot more complexity to it. You could get a corrupted item and it can actually end up being worse than just the base item without any effects at all. That's what the cleansing portion is for, obviously, but wouldn't it be so much more interesting if you could collect this corruptive influence from cleansing some corrupted items and force it onto some items yourself? It doesn't have to be a quick process or a one-for-one kind of deal, but if you cleanse, say, 5 items because you weren't too happy with them, being able to create one corrupted item of your choosing from that process doesn't seem too far-fetched. That removes one layer of RNG from this new system every once in a while and gives you some control over what items to empower. You still have every other layer of RNG to work your way through to get a decent item, so it's not even a guaranteed upgrade either way. The only thing you'd be able to decide is which item gets corrupted. Which, by the way, can we just take a moment and actually go through the RNG thing real quick? You have to get lucky enough for an item to become corrupted, then you have a wide variety of effects that you could benefit from. You're probably only ever going to be interested in maybe 2 or 3 at most, so you have to hope you get the right effect. Then there are 3 different tiers of effects, so you have to hope to get the right tier. Not necessarily the highest tier, because you need to manage your corruption effectively, and then you also have another layer of RNG in how much corruption an item will actually give. If an item rolls perfectly, but it also rolls with the highest possible corruption, that could be the difference between having to deal with an extra debuff or not. Even down at the lowest levels, the range for a tier 1 effect is 5 to 10 corruption. So if you get lucky, you could get 2 items with 5 corruption each. If you get unlucky, you could have 1 item with 10 corruption. That's the same corruption level, so both of these players would have to deal with the same negative effects, but one of them has twice the corrupted gear equipped. That's a pretty significant difference, and the only thing you can do is cross your fingers. A perfect item under the Titanforging system was very difficult to obtain, and it relied entirely on luck. That's why many players just didn't like it. It was RNG on RNG, and it made gearing up a constant treadmill that almost never ended. Getting a perfect item under the new corrupted system seems nigh impossible. You have so many hoops to jump through, so many die to roll. Getting the perfect alignment is going to be super rare. Almost so rare that it's not even worth thinking about. Maybe that's the dev team's plan here, make this system so random that it's pointless even trying to chase after a perfect item in the first place. It still kinda baffles me that they're replacing an RNG system that people don't like because of the RNG with another RNG system, except it's way more random. Another issue is definitely going to crop up when you start comparing these effects against each other, because more effects means more corruption, and more corruption means more things you have to deal with or avoid or work around. The chances of you taking some of the lackluster bonuses is very slim indeed. Is it going to be worth it to increase the power of that slow and the size of that corruption zone just to get a little bit more avoidance or health regen or extra healing received? I just don't see it happening, so you're going to get excited whenever one of the secondary stat effects drops, or maybe even that huge crit damage increase effect, which by the way is the only effect that I can see where you will actually want multiple tier 1 bonuses instead of the tier 3. You can get 5% additional crit damage for 5 to 10 corruption, or 7% additional crit damage for 20 to 25 corruption. It's going to be significantly better stacking multiple corrupted tier 1 crit damage pieces when compared to getting the tier 3 crit damage pieces, so in that case the lower the tier of corruption the better, which will probably get changed because that seems kind of counterintuitive, but as I was saying, you'll get excited for the good ones, and if a bad one drops you'll probably just cleanse it right away. It's not even going to be a consideration, it's just not going to be worth the extra corruption. That makes me wonder a little bit what the point of some of these bonuses actually is. But one thing that does mean is, with this new system, it's now entirely possible to get a bad Titanforge. That wasn't a thing in the past. A Titanforge was just a straight upgrade for the piece no matter what. But with the corrupted gear, you might actually want to take the entire upgrade off of a piece of gear because it makes the piece of gear worse. How's that for RNG? For right now, I'm not a big fan of this system. I think RNG works well in a game where you can mass loot items. Diablo is a perfect example. World of Warcraft, not so much. It seems much more enticing and rewarding when they stick to currencies and vendors. It may seem old or outdated or not as exciting because you're not winning the lottery, but having a currency you can farm and collect, and then having a vendor you can pick and choose your reward from gives you way more control over the situation. That's why Benthic gear worked so well. You could create as many items as you had the pearls for, and you could actively target certain pieces of gear. Farming pearls was something you had to actively do, and you got a reward from it. It was something you were always working towards. When you're just talking about randomly upgrading gear that drops from various activities, you still don't have any control over the situation. It's still a slot machine, except with this variant, you have more pictures you need to line up. It's actually kind of frustrating. Until this current build of the PTR, there was a new currency called Echoes of Oblivion. You can see it in the very first 8.3 preview I did. This currency came from the Assaults and Visions, and you could use them to purchase gear from a vendor relating to Rathian and his crew. That currency and those gear vendors disappeared with the introduction of corrupted items onto the PTR, so they had some plans or ideas to have another gear vendor, but for right now it looks like they scrapped them entirely. It is worth noting that any item in Season 4 of Battle for Azeroth that comes from the usual sources, that would be the new raid tier, Mythic Plus in the new season, PvP in the new season, as well as the heroic Darkshore Warfront loot, and any new or updated source of loot with Season 4 of Battle for Azeroth, all of that stuff has the chance to become corrupted. So it's not just new raid gear and loot, this corruption is going to be popping up all over the place. I can see how this system might have looked good on paper. It's Kiss Curse, power corrupts, you get a bonus but you also have to pay the price. It could make for some really interesting decisions if this were more of a role-playing game at this point, but it's not. For the vast majority of Mythic Raiders, they'll play it safe or disable the corruption entirely because they want to be as reliable as possible. Dying in a fight because your slow effect procced when you had to move is kind of unacceptable. Removing that sort of outlier is key to success. As you get into less serious raiding and PvE content, people will probably play around with it a lot more, but if dealing with the corruption becomes too much of a hassle or takes away from their enjoyment, like getting them killed over and over again while doing world quests, I can see those players cleansing half of their gear as well. Admittedly, this could be hilarious in PvP. Can you imagine a super serious, laser-focused duel suddenly ending because the rogue you're trying to kill farted out a massive corruption cloud and they're trying to run for the hills? People will be all over the place trying to avoid their own corruption and debuffs. It could be pretty funny to watch. I feel like a lot of this does depend on how the corruption resistance works though. The blue post said we should be able to equip 2 items later on with minimal effects from the corruption, so I guess we should be able to negate maybe 40 corruption as we upgrade our cloak and gain other sources of resistance. This means this system also comes with a time gate. If you want to use the powers of corrupted gear earlier, you can try and work around the corruption debuffs, but as the patch unfolds, the risk of equipping corrupted gear will diminish. I can see the sources of corruption resistance being the key factor here in whether players end up liking this feature or not. If they have to grind and grind and grind for a little bit of resistance, that's going to make things so much worse. Until we find out where resistance comes from, this is just another RNG pile-on from where I'm standing. I'm not all too excited for it right now, but I hope some changes are added onto the PTR that manage to sway me before the patch goes live. And hey, the good news is that if you don't like the idea of corrupted gear, it's only for this last patch of BfA. They could let us get away with some crazy stuff, like by the end of the patch we're equipping full corrupted gear and doing some insane damage. This is also the perfect opportunity to get rid of Titanforging going forward. We won't have Titanforging in the last patch of BfA, so they would actually have to bring it back for the future expansion if that's something they wanted to do. If they get rid of corrupted at the end of BfA and just move into their next expansion without touching Titanforging, it could be the perfect time to just sweep it under the rug, slowly, casually, quietly, without having to address it too much. Might be the perfect chance to be done with it finally. So that's the new corrupted gear feature coming in patch 8.3 and the replacement for Titanforging, which is being removed for the time being. What do you think from what you've seen so far? Have we taken a huge step backwards? Is this actually worse than Titanforging? Do you think it could end up being worthwhile taking a few pieces of corrupted gear, or do you think those corruption debuffs just won't ever be worth the hassle? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.